And joining us now on the debate, Vincent Lam, emergency physician and author of Bloodletting and Miraculous Cures. Brian Francis, author of Natural Order. Joe Dunthorne, author of Wild Abandon. Johanna Skibsrud, author of This Will Be Difficult to Explain. And John Barber, publishing reporter at the Globe and Mail. Well, hello, all of you. We certainly have an eclectic group, 4 authors and a journalist here. So before we delve into the heart of tonight's conversation, I want to start with getting to know you each a little bit better, who you are, what you're working on. So Vincent Lam, let's begin with you. Your book, your last book, Bloodletting and Miraculous Cures, mixed your 2 professions of doctor and writer. What are you working on now?
Well, I have a novel coming in the spring called The Headmaster's Wager. And it really speaks to my heritage as a Chinese person from Vietnam, and is set in that community during the war, which we call the Vietnam War, and they call the American War.
Joe Dunthorne, you are a novelist and a poet. What are you working on?
I'm actually kind of getting back to poetry after 2 novels. So I feel like I've been writing novels for 6 years, and I'm going to try and take a year off and write some poems now.
Back to poetry.
Back to poetry,
okay.
Although no one wants you to write poetry, but I'm...
No one wants you to write poetry?
No, I'm afraid not. No, well, few people.
Around the table, perhaps.
Yes, exactly.
Johanna, you're still in the glow of your Giller win last year. What are you working on now?
Well, I've just come out with, as you said, a collection of short fiction, so I'm busy promoting that now, and then over the winter I'll be back working on a second novel.
Brian Francis, you got a new book out, don't you?
Yes, I do. It just came out a couple months ago. It's called Natural Order, and I'm not working on anything new right now because I'm too scared to start the 3rd book.
Why are you scared?
Because the 2nd book took such a long time to write, and it's like an emotional relationship. It's kind of like dating, where it's like you don't know if you really want to get invested with these characters because you're going to be spending a lot of time with them. So right now I feel like I'm just kind of dating some story ideas.
Right. You're post-breakup, trying out the field there.
Yes, trying out the, getting my feet wet.
We'll leave it at that.
Okay.
John Barber, we're here today to talk about trying to understand this relatively new genre called creative nonfiction. You write and analyze these writers. I want to talk about that genre. What the heck does creative nonfiction mean?
Well, it's an interesting term. I think the term sort of is a little bit shaky, really. What's nonfiction? Nonfiction is fact. Well, what's creative about facts? You're talking about creative facts, and it sounds like you're making things up. So there's always a tension here between what's strictly factual and what you can get away with. So there's an indeterminate quality to it that most people, a lot of people, aren't very comfortable with, I think. Just as they weren't comfortable with the novel when it first arrived 200 years ago.
Johanna, your last book was historical fiction. Explain to me how creative nonfiction is different from historical fiction.
Okay, well, first of all, I don't actually identify my book as historical fiction because it really, well, I talk about it as exploring the sort of space between fact and fiction. It began with sparks that my father shared with me of his experiences in the Vietnam War. Because his memory was very shaky, you know, after 30 years of not discussing his experiences, I really was left with very little, so necessarily I fictionalized this, and then also, you know, place those fictionalized stories within a network of other fictional stories. So it's quite removed from any historical context, and so but what I was interested in doing was exploring just that space of where these memories are created, how our histories get created, and you know, the very creative and always shifting and changing processes that make up those histories.
You know, it's interesting, you don't like the categorization that bookstores and booksellers give to you, but that's what we do in literature, at least for consumers. We categorize things. And one of the categories that has gotten itself into trouble is this creative nonfiction. And John, I want to bring up a specific example. Greg Mortenson's book, 3 Cups of Tea, a creative nonfiction book. It gained notoriety because of its pitfalls. So remind us what happened in that case.
Well, it was a very inspiring book about a philanthropist who stumbled into a village in the high Himalaya and had an insight and became a leading philanthropist, raising a lot of money to build schools in these places, and sold bajillions and bajillions of books because it was a very inspiring story. It appeared to offer a solution to the political problems that were so intractable, that if you educated people, then you could rescue them somehow. And it was exposed by John Krakauer, who was a very well-known nonfiction writer, as being much, much less than true, and sometimes downright fraudulent.
Mortensen lied.
Very much so, yeah. Yeah, and played fast and loose with a lot of the contributions that people gave him in order to build schools in the Himalayas.
Okay, let me throw this out there. Mortensen lies, fabricates a tale. Brian, if his book, though, which many people say it did, sent out a very positive message, should we care if the story's not completely true?
Yes, I think so. Because it's not so much what the writer is creating, I think it's what the reader's buying. And I think that if the reader is told that this is a true story, then it has to be a true story. And I think you can understand how the disconnect happens between the writer and the publisher and the marketing side of things at times. That you could see that I think readers in general tend to put more value on things that are based on actual events rather than something that's completely fabricated. So from a marketing standpoint, I think there's a tendency sometimes to say, and it's the same with movies as well, based on a true story or inspired by true events. And there seems to be, and I don't think that's something that the publishers necessarily are doing, but it seems that the public seems to gravitate towards stories that have truth in them. To what degree? I think that's kind of the question, is how true does a story need to be in order to be considered true?
Okay, we're going to talk more about that as we move on, but Johanna, I want to try this one out with you. When a book is about real people and real events and real time, should there be a fidelity both to truth and storytelling?
Yeah, I think that it definitely depends on your approach, like a journalistic approach or a memoir approach. If you're pitching it, like Brian's saying, as truth, I do think that there needs to be an attempt to be as faithful to the facts as possible. But I do think, and I think that this is where, you know, that I think that marketing and departments, as well as, you know, just culturally in general, we shouldn't be encouraging people to steer away from fiction as a way of exploring the truth. I think that you know, it's a really tremendously powerful way of exploring the truth. And I remember actually I did a talk at Queen's University not too long ago, and we were talking about the fact fiction you know, division, and someone put up their hand and said, you know, the reason why I write fiction is because it's the only place that I can tell the truth. And I think that there is really, you know, a space that opens up there where you know, a more general and open space of exploring a number of different possibilities, opening up our imaginations, which is so important for creating empathy with readers and with each other, as it becomes possible.
Vincent, what do you make of that?
I agree completely. You know, I think that when we learn about something and live something in our, quote, real lives, we understand the dynamics that are occurring between people in a way that's very ephemeral and which may not necessarily be depicted by the facts as they are laid out in a notarized, orderly fashion, right? There are certain things which we feel and understand about those dynamics which emerge from a narrative perspective. And that's the narrative perspective that we have as human beings, and which subsequently writers also have as writers. So to express...
You also, sorry to interrupt, you get the right to go inside somebody's head, right? That's what a novelist does. They can go inside different people's heads. And that's where you find those truths, I think.
Yes.
Which no fact could ever support.
And furthermore, you know, I think sometimes that we are mistaken if we want to rely upon what is supposedly the facts, supposedly are the facts, as some sort of crutch to give validity, right? Because those are not necessary.
Give us examples of what you're talking about.
Well, you know, I'll sort of course, I'm familiar with the process that I went through with bloodletting, and in bloodletting and miraculous cures, I wrote about doctors, medical students in hospitals, and that's a setting that I know quite well because I happen to be a doctor. But what I actually discovered was that the things that actually happened and the way they actually happened allowed me to understand certain things, but those did not necessarily work as fiction. The sequence of events was not compelling. The people didn't necessarily say the things which I thought would be most revealing about their state of mind, although I understood their state of mind. And I understood my state of mind, but it doesn't mean that I necessarily said what I thought, because if doctors all said what they thought, that would be, you know, that would be a total disaster from a healthcare point of view. So I took those emotions, and what I felt was the narrative truth to it. I used a setting that I understood, but made fiction, and that's legitimate. You know, I agree completely with Joanna. We can't undermine the legitimacy of that project.
And I think that that's the built-in, most basic function of any telling of a story. If we're in a pub and we tell a story to each other, we embellish and we reorganize and we make the story work in the best way we can. We don't view that as lying. It's just part of our automatic storytelling process. If the chronology doesn't work for the story, then you swap things around a little bit. No one's going to tell you off for that.
But I think if you write a book of nonfiction, you know, and you say, this is nonfiction, then it changes the game a bit. You know, I agree completely. In fiction, we borrow, we peck at the brightest, shiniest things, you know, and voila. But I think it's problematic if that same book is billed as nonfiction. But I think, why does it have to be?
There's a question of whether any nonfiction actually reaches truth. To think that you're reading nonfiction and you're getting the true story seems to me inherently false anyway. I always, you know, you're reading nonfiction, it's still a perspective. I
don't think that's a proposition, though. I think that what you're doing is you're getting a certain guarantee that, you know, these things that I said did happen, these people who said this did say this, you know, this sequence of events did occur in this way. And as you're right, the more artless it is, the truer it is.
That's right. You're almost looking for a transcript, aren't you?
Yeah, I mean, that's what you end up with, unless you start shaping it and juicing it and rearranging it, and then all of a sudden you're up to your thighs in ambiguity and distrust between you and your reader, I think.
But John, let me do a little pushback here. I'm going to borrow from Ben Mesrick, who wrote The Accident Billionaire, creative nonfiction, and he argues that the human truths that are, you know, allegedly conveyed are more important than whether the certain events are literally correct. Do you buy that defense?
No, not in the least. I mean, I think that you have to make rules that are understandable to the reader, and that you keep to. You can't just give yourself a license to say, "Oh, some of it's true and some of it's not true." You know.
Why not?
Because the reader expects it to be true if you tell them it's true. In fact, readers ache for it to be true, and that's the problem. That's why people get away with spinning so many yarns. They take reality, which is shapeless, and they turn it into something which is compelling, generally with an uplifting ending, right? And that becomes the true story. But
we have a variation of this same problem, or same issue. Maybe I shouldn't say it's a problem. It's a phenomenon in medicine, which is that the anecdote is all powerful.
Yeah.
And so people know someone, you know, who had, you know, an enema of echinacea, and this cured their metastatic cancer, right? And this becomes a powerful and compelling anecdote, but it doesn't substitute for statistics and facts. And I think that one can somewhat draw a similar analogy in the writing of nonfiction. You know, I think fiction, different, right? We can take licenses, but nonfiction, to say, well, I'm going to make my historical case based on this anecdote. I mean, that's problematic to start with, but then if it turns out the anecdote isn't even true.
Yeah. We're going to talk more about why societally we're so interested in the anecdote rather than maybe the pure facts as we move on. But I want to talk about one more very infamous case that, of course, was by James Frey, who wrote a million pieces, little pieces, pardon me, and it was revealed, of course, to be most fiction. He was the guy that was said to have conned Oprah. Here's an excerpt of an interview he did. Let's take a look at this clip with Frey's interview with Oprah.
Personally, I think most memoirs do that. I don't have a whole lot of respect for the genre. I think most writers of memoirs, and this is a very unpopular statement, do what I did. I think when you're trying to tell a story and write a book, you manipulate things, you embellish things, you fabricate things, you play around with things to tell the best story you can.
Brian Francis, how bothered are you by that episode?
I'm bothered by it because I think that for me, when I'm setting out to write, fiction writers essentially set out with a lie. What I'm telling you is not true. I'm honest about that. Now, what you choose to take out of that as far as the truth is up to the reader. I'm not selling you the truth. It's up to you to decide, is there truth in this work of fiction? How does it apply to me? If the writer is selling it as truth, and then it kind of comes out that, well, I've changed this, I've changed that. I was saying to Joe on the cab ride here that, you know, when I read a memoir and it starts off by saying, you know, I woke up that morning and the sky was a beautiful shade of blue and the clouds were kind of cotton candy-ish looking, but little did I know that that was going to be the day that my whole life would change. I don't believe you, because I don't believe that you remember that the weather was what it was like that day. And so I'm suspicious of memoirs, and I'm suspicious sometimes of nonfiction where they get into the headspace of one of the actual people, so that if it was a story about, let's say, a murdered girl, that the writer gets inside the head of the girl and says, you know, she was really looking forward to starting school that year, or she, you know, there's this sense of creative liberty, I think, sometimes that for me as a fiction writer I take issue with, because I just feel that it's false. Whereas I'm starting false. I'm saying it's not real. Whether or not you want to see truth in that is up to you, and that's your decision as the reader. I know that there's truth in my writing, but I'm not selling it to you as the truth. I'm selling it the opposite way. John
Barber, Brian's suspicious of the term memoir. Is it the marketing term that's the problem?
No, I don't think so. I think that Frey was absolutely correct in what he said. The memoir is a slippery kind of a beast, but to pick up on what Brian was saying, it makes no real guarantees. You know, memoir is not necessarily autobiography, and even in either case, you know that nobody knows himself well enough to write authoritatively about themselves. I mean, that's something we take for granted. So I don't think that the memoir is in itself a bad thing. I think it's always been a kind of a half-breed that thrives despite its, you know, maybe insincere origins.
We talked earlier, I think, Johanna, you brought it up about films. And we think about films like The Social Network that are partially rooted in fact, but heavily fictionalized. And we see a disclaimer at the beginning. You know, we're all sitting in the movie theater eating our popcorn, and, well, most of us don't pay attention to it, but we do see the disclaimer does come by saying, you know, not all of these events and people are true. They're based on some, you know, facts on the ground, but this is a fictionalized account. Would creative nonfiction benefit from the same kind of disclaimer?
I think so. I mean, I think that there are, because they're, like John's saying, that there, you know, that even the term memoir, and like I was talking before about, you know, what I was forced, encouraged, you know, I'm a fiction writer, so it came more naturally to me to want to embellish the facts that I was given from my father's stories into fiction. But that's just, you know, a natural part of the process of memory, as also Joe was saying. And so even the term memoir, I think, speaks to that natural process. But I think that, you know, pointing out that fact, like to deal with some of these issues of people being, you know, sold a bill of goods, basically, could be useful in the creative nonfiction and memoir genres as well. But what I'm disturbed mostly with this, with the case of Frey, is that he says now, anyway, that he started the book as a novel and then was encouraged by the marketing departments to pitch it as a memoir. And he cites, you know, Fitzgerald, Hemingway, who have written novels with a great deal of autobiographical content, but then, you know, says, well, in this day and age, you know, the marketing pressure is that people want the truth, they want something to latch onto, and they really need this. And, you know, and that's, again, going back to my original point, I think what we should be wanting to move away from, to move back to a space where we can embrace fiction as a way of experiencing and sharing our stories in a real and truthful way.
Well, so let me pick up on what Johanna said. I mean, how much pressure is there from publishing companies, from marketing types, from agents, to push your work in a way that maybe you're not so comfortable with?
Well, I think in terms of the memoir thing, you know, it's the first question you get asked as an author about your work is this a true story? Is this real? And I've had that lots. I think that's a understandable automatic thing. As readers, you search for the thing that feels true. And in fiction, it may be made up, but you still think to yourself, I suspect that this is coming from a real place in the author's life, which is what gives it its kind of energy. And I think if you had a little disclaimer at the beginning of a book, you know, like based on a true story at the beginning of a film, you're green-lighting the reader to give it their full faith. It won't be true. It'll be manipulated in some way. And I think publishers and agents understand that that's a desire totally built into the reading experience, is to feel like you're getting something real.
But, you know, we're putting the responsibility here on the people that deliver the goods, people who write it, who deliver. What about the reader, John? How much onus should be on the reader to know what they're sort of getting themselves into, to know that what they're reading is a certain genre and what that genre really means?
Well, I mean, the reader is the ultimate sinner in this case, because the reader is indiscriminate and the reader wants to believe things that aren't true. So when you talk about these stories that say that they try to gain authority because they're based on a true story, we're shaping reality in an archetypal form that will deliver the sort of feelings or the sort of insights that fiction does. So these are fictions, right? People want to believe that they're true. They want to believe that that things work out, especially, right? That's why people buy books, because the detective solves it at the end of the thing. So, you know, 95% of all the entertainment we consume contains an uplifting message, which is completely contrary to our daily experience. And so if you can say to somebody, this is really true, we are fighting the war on terrorism by building, you know, 3 brick schoolhouses in northwest Pakistan, then people will buy it.
Well, that was a lot of the people who leapt to Mortenson's defense said, you know, in the day that we're in, people are searching for heroes. So he didn't really commit a crime, a literary sin. He gave people what they were looking for, which was a happy ending.
He took a lot of their money and spent a lot of time flying around first class in jets and staying in lavish hotels and firing you know, directors who told him to stop spending this way, and a lot of bad behavior, just plain outright.
It seems to me that the betrayal in that story is not necessarily that the story has been manipulated and fictionalized. The betrayal is that the schools he's claimed to create aren't properly functioning or aren't open or aren't working. That's really bad to me.
But don't you think the two things go together?
I don't know, not really. I'm happy for him to lie and tell the story in the way he wants to if the schools get.
You know, a friend of mine had read that book, and I was sharing books with her, and I had the one by Krakauer, the very thin one that debunked the whole thing. I said, here, if you've read Mortenson, you should read this. And she said, what is this? I said, well, he's debunking. She said, I don't want to read it. Get it away from me, right? Yeah. And I thought, well, I understand that. You know, how do I know that one's not made up? She says. I couldn't answer her.
I think another problem with like this emphasis more on fiction, on fact, is that if you read a book and it tells you that this network of schools is being set up, and you believe that and you take that at face value, you shut the door shut the door on that book. You shut the book and you feel happy that has sort of tidily wrapped itself up, and that's a fact, and you can leave happily. Whereas I think that fiction it opens up a space of questions. Whereas when we move away from trusting that process of entering into a fictional world and being a part of that process and asking those questions, and we rely more and more heavily on fact, then I think that we're shutting ourselves out of a really necessary, engaged process in thinking about our world. If we're taking more and more of the facts, like this, where the responsibility of the reader comes in, to take everything, like including things that are pitched to us as nonfiction, to approach it with a certain critical eye and gaze and desire to actually be involved in that process of learning and questioning.
I think we have a set of strange contradictions in our popular culture. I mean, on one hand, we have this phenomenon, I don't know if anyone here has heard of it, called reality television. And reality television is such a strange perversion, really, of that term, because anyone who watches it understands immediately that the whole thing is contrived, right? And then the whole thing is supposed to be built on this notion that within the contrivance, within this artificial game that's being played, what's happening is spontaneous and true, right? So somehow that's okay, and we become involved in that as a kind of truth, right? And then meanwhile, out there in the world, we're looking for heroes like Mortensen, and you know, and his example to me is a fairly gross one, but we also look for heroes in our sports figures, in our politicians, and then, you know, well, guess what? You know, it turns out he had an affair. It turns out she had a few too many to drink that night and said something regrettable. Then that becomes somehow sort of a career stain, which is very contradictory, you know, because you know, I think most of us have done one or two things at some point in our lives, and which we later come to regret.
Don't get caught on camera. The internet never forgets.
It's a strange thing where we don't want what we get, which is actually true, and that stuff is the messiness and the complications of real people in their real lives. Look, it's not all neat and packaged, right? There's some gritty, not nice bits here. And yet we're completely willing to go out and fabricate some sort of reality and be dedicated to that fabrication. I mean, it's very strange.
Well, that's where fiction works, I think, because people are dedicated to that, and it is edifying on some level. You know, maybe not Jersey Shore, but there's a continuum between that and Tolstoy, surely.
Is there? That could be something of an hour-long discussion.
Let's cut it right now.
Okay, I want to move on and discuss the line between embellishment and obscuring the facts. So let's try this one out, John. How much creative license should nonfiction authors actually have? Brian mentioned earlier, you know, memoirs, leaves falling on a, you know, nice day is not really truth-telling.
No, and I think that one of the things that Brian mentioned was the idea of getting inside somebody's head. You know, I mean, everybody has their own standards, can make their own rules. I'm not going to give anybody any rules, but if I'm going to like it, and if it does that, then I'm not going to, then it can't do that, is what I'm saying. So, I mean, you know, if you're a journalist, you get to sort of inhabit a kind of a citadel, really. I mean, sometimes our stories are not very shapely, but there is a guarantee in there that if it's not the truth, as I said, these things actually did happen, and they're fairly represented to the best of our ability. And I think if you look at scholarly writing, historical writing, these magnificent feats of intellectual energy go into establishing the truth about the past, right? I object to novelists who come along plundering that and start making things up in the margins of actual history. But that's a different subject, perhaps.
You said you're not going to give anyone rules, but there are the traditionalists and biographers who say it should be a legal offense to fabricate parts of nonfiction books. But I guess the problem is with the amount of content being churned out, the amount of books coming out, how do you really do that, Joe? How would that even work? Can you see it as a possibility?
I don't know how you can kind of create a set of parameters for that. I don't think it's possible. Yeah.
I don't either. I mean, I think that it would be really unfortunate to try, and I actually don't think that there's a real issue with there being a slippery border there between fact and fiction and between these categories that we're talking about, because it promotes a discussion, it promotes a sort of a reassessment, continual reassessment of what do we mean by truth, what do we mean by accurately portraying, what do we mean by the ethics of representation or identity. And I think that these are conversations that have to continually happen, and that this is one way that they do.
You mentioned the word truth. I mean, this really is about trust and the relationship between writer and reader. And I'm wondering, Brian, if this trend continues, this creative nonfiction where there's some pitfalls, some people are taking, let's call it artistic license with us. Is trust going to pay the price for this continuing trend?
I think so. I think that, I mean, when I'm setting out to write something, I think this is the same with any writer, is that you have to establish credibility. And the same with journalism, that you have to establish a sense that whoever is digesting that material believes you. There has to be an authenticity in the work. And I think whether it's fiction or whether it's nonfiction or creative, whatever it might be, there has to be sincerity behind the words. There has to be an authenticity. And I think that's where the trust is built. And when the reader can't trust the writer, when the reader can't trust what it is the writer's what the writer's saying, then I just think you've lost the book, whether it's a nonfiction book or whether it's a fiction book, because it's a very intimate relationship. Unlike film or television where you're kind of watched by the masses, a book is read one reader at a time, and it's you and the reader together engaged for 300 pages, 250 pages. So you have to form a sense of trust with that one person in that book. And once that's gone, once your credibility is gone, I think you've lost that reader.
You say TV's different, and Vince, you brought up the idea of reality TV. I mean, books have been a bit sacred. I mean, that's what Brian's saying. They were in a category of their own, that very intimate trust between reader and writer is sort of untouchable. Are we seeing that vanishing?
Well, you know, I think that one of the worries that the publishing industry has is how to sell books. Right? And this is no surprise to anyone. And so, you know, I think sometimes if the industry is overly concerned with just selling books, then the industry may do things which are short-sighted and which don't give the reader enough credit. And I agree completely that the trust is perhaps the most important phenomenon which occurs within the book between writer and reader. And so it's a very short-sighted thing to say that, well, we're going to play fast and loose with that trust to sell a few books, because in the long term, if the industry relies upon that relationship, then that's a problem for the industry. Fiction, again, totally different, a way of exploring emotional truth. But, you know, there's great writing, for instance, in The New Yorker, right? And I remember listening to David Sedaris talk about, he gave a talk and he talked about his work with The New Yorker, and he read a short excerpt, and in it there were different things, you know. I hope I'm recalling correctly, that he was talking about saying to his father that his father looked great in a particular kind of t-shirt or something, right, like a tank top. And so, you know, in due course, the New Yorker magazine called his father and asked him, did he say that? Did this exchange happen, right?
They fact-checked.
They fact-checked, and they fact-check obsessively, right? But we all know there is great, perhaps the greatest narrative nonfiction to be found in any publication on earth in the New Yorker, right? It can be done. It's not that it cannot be achieved. It can be done.
I think, too, the issue with the trust, though, is that for a lot of memoirists, you really have that one story in you. Like, chances are, if you've written your memoir, you might not have another one come out, or you might not have a third one come out. So you've got sort of one story. So from a fiction standpoint, you're in a long-term relationship with the reader. Like, you're hoping to build that trust book by book by book. With a memoir, in some ways too, you don't, I mean, you might be able to garner that trust within a single book, but chances are that writer might not be coming back again with another memoir because the material isn't there. And even with David Sedaris, I think he's a fantastic writer. But even in his later books, I've kind of noticed there seems to be a bit of a far-reachingness, that the everyday, the things that are remarkable, or the things that he can write about, it seems like the material is getting a little kind of on the thin side, because, let's be honest, you know, our lives are pretty mundane for the most part, and so how many remarkable things can happen to us on the way to the grocery store?
But of course, we're writers, so we have mundane lives.
Well,
other people have very exciting lives, I've heard,
yeah.
so I'm told.
Memoirs, creative nonfiction, growing trend, Johanna. To what extent does this devalue the kind of work that you all do, which is fiction writing? Does it devalue it?
No, I don't think it devalues it. I think that that there, as I've been saying, like, I think that we do need to continue to embrace and to celebrate what fiction does, and I think that there will be a return again and a recognition of that, and just how much, as Brian's saying, how much flexibility and material there is, and how worthwhile it is to explore that through fiction. I mean, when I'm asked the question about, you know, can you only write from experience or do you invent? I mean, to me, it's you know, the question is both. It's yes, I only write from experience, and yes, I invent, because obviously you can only write from the experiences that you've had, but because we have imaginations, we can, you know, we can recombine that in so many, like, absolutely limitless, you know, ways. And I think that that is, again, the real gift that fiction offers us, as a way to expand our own experience, expand that, share that, and it really broaden our collective imaginations.
And just thinking on this trust thing, you know, in a way, I think the fact that creative nonfiction is, you know, this idea that it's breaking down the trust is actually a good thing, because in all truth, memoirs since forever have been part fiction and they've been made up. If the audience is now realizing that there's a web of lies in all the things they've been told are true, then it just points to the fact that fiction is still the home of truth, and that, like, you're being told it's a memoir, it's a fiction also contains memoir and is truth. You know, the boundaries just aren't clear, and I think in a way, people like James Frey revealing that, it's a good thing.
It's funny, the book which just won the Booker, Julian Barnes's novel, plays with this notion of recollection and memory, and there's a particular exchange in which a schoolmaster asks some boys, I think the question, I could be getting this wrong, that's my disclaimer, right? But I think the question is, what is history? And I think the protagonist or someone else, see, I'm being very careful now in this context, I'm hedging my bets because of our conversation, says, well, history is written by the victors. And the schoolmaster sort of stops and says, well, I'll accept that if you accept that it's also the delusions held by the defeated. Which I thought, you know, and of course there's a real sense in which, as you say, history is not objective. But I think, you know, the twists to objectivity are in a bit of a different category than, you know, things portrayed as fact which the writer knows are not true.
I think it's about journalism, not about fiction, non-fiction. I think it's wonderful to have that ambiguity between the covers of a book, and I don't think there's any rules. The problem is that these days people seem to choose their facts with the same sort of discretion that they choose, you know, their reading in fiction, so that nobody believes anything that anybody tells them about what's actually going on, and they go to the network which is not going to tell them that. It's going to tell them something that they would prefer to believe is true. So.
Joe, why is this all gaining steam now? Joe makes the point the memoir's been around for a gajillion years and it's always been the same thing, but we are seeing a rise in all of this. What do you see sort of culturally or societally about why that's happening now?
I think it has everything to do with the means of communication. I think that it's the internet is making this happen, you know. Blame the internet.
We blame the internet for an awful lot these days. Yeah,
well, I think there's no question about that. And, you know, the word of the day is Colbert's truthiness. But again, I think it's more about what really purports to being true having no authority, and that people choosing their different categories of truth the same way they press a button to choose a television program.
Vincent Lam, do you buy that?
Well, you know, we wish that things would always work out the way we want them to, right? And so an entire nation believed that its housing prices would continue to rise relentlessly, inexorably, and they would be able to borrow money.
Not naming any names.
Well, and you know, I wouldn't exclude ourselves in Canada. And then afterwards, and so there was a real estate bubble in the US which popped, horrific consequences, we know them all too well. But the funny thing is that afterwards it all looked so self-evident, right? Suddenly it seemed as if, oh, the veil was lifted and anyone should have seen. But it wasn't so easy to see, right? And yet, what would one say is more true than the value of my house, right? Getting away from words on a page and the objectivity and subjectivity which can enter into that. You know, what could possibly be more concrete than what my house is worth in my life in terms of what people stand on? And yet it turns out we may not have it quite right.
You know, but it seems to me that nowadays the public is really craving stories that are rooted in reality. Maybe more so than before, Brian?
I think so. I think that's, you know, a product of television and the internet. And I think people seem to want the tangible. They want to sort of feel the actual experiences of the people. They want to meet these people that have lived these incredible lives. I think that's, you know, the talk shows and the reality shows. But also I think, you know, it's difficult to talk about fiction. It's difficult to have a dialogue about what a fiction book is about, because it can be about a number of different things to a number of different people. Whereas nonfiction books, it's easier to talk about them. You'll see, like, nonfiction books tend to be profiled in magazines a little bit more. They get more publicity because it's about the person and their story as opposed to what the book is about necessarily. And I just think it's easier to, you know, from a language standpoint, to talk about nonfiction. So I think it does kind of get highlighted a little bit more within the media than a fiction book would.
Joanna, what do you think is going on here? Why is this happening now?
Well, I think that, I mean, it's come up several times here, and I think that we're sort of starting this conversation with this assumption that we generally start with these days, that no, history is not objective, and that, you know, obviously we approach all stories, all realities with our own subjectivities. But this is a relatively new approach, and I think that, you know, what's happened is basically, as a culture, we've had the rug, you know, taken out from under us, and we're grasping for, you know, some sense of security by looking for reality in these ways through, you know, reality television, through renewed or sudden interest in memoirs or creative nonfiction. And I just think that, yeah, we're reestablishing a space of comfort, and maybe there's some growing pains that are going on, but I think that has something to do with that.
I just think that there's an element for me that fictions are, at the moment, incapable of representing the complexity of our modern lives. And it's just impossible for a book to really capture the things that are going on in the internet. You know, this idea of truth is stranger than fiction. I feel like that's never been more true. If you wrote about the things that if you wrote a fiction about the things that you found on the internet, people would say you were being ridiculous, but of course they're there for us to see. So I just feel that there's this sense that reality is not replicable in fiction, so people go to non-fiction to try and see our modern world.
So it's a trouble for today. I mean, the internet, again, we're going back to John's point, the internet has caused all our problems for writing.
It appears
We're
so,
blaming
yes.
the internet. Okay, we solved this one. Okay, I want to go back full circle to the idea of approaching truth in writing. And I want to read this excerpt. This comes from an article in the Guardian newspaper. It's a conversation with author David Shields. Here's what was written. David Shields is bored by the novel. As a form, he argues, it tends to be too hidebound by plot, too traditional and old-fashioned to reflect the speed of 21st century culture. He is particularly bored by the well-wrought, beautifully written literary novel as exemplified by Ian McEwan's Atonement and Jonathan Franzen's The Corrections. I read these books, and my overwhelming feeling is, you've got to be kidding, Shields told The Observer recently. In no way do these texts convey what it feels like to live in the 21st century. Like most novels, they are essentially works of nostalgic entertainment. Vincent Lam, is he right? Do you agree with this?
Sounds like there's some sour grapes there somewhere. I'm sorry, that's my first reaction. Well, you know, I think that that both writing and reading assumes a certain type of goodwill, and without that, it doesn't work. And you know, I think part of that that goodwill is to understand that one is entering a particular narrative, right? It's a specific narrative, and it encompasses often one or not more than several central characters, as well as a number of other, shall we say, secondary characters. But the thread of that story is something that's woven, and if you want to read the novel and enjoy it, you have to follow that thread. I think, if the contention which is being made is that somehow that thread does not represent the entirety of humanity's experience in the 21st century, then I don't find that especially surprising, but I'm not sure that's the project of the novel. Mm-hmm. I think the project of the novel is to, as John says, enter a mind and follow the thread.
I don't think he's suggesting that it should represent the entirety of humanity, but I don't think many novels attempt to represent any of our current reality. It's a very difficult thing to do. Is that guy Tao Lin? Have you read him? He tries to, he includes Gmail chats as if they were dialogue just communicated between me and you. So he doesn't, it's like, it's as if they were speaking in person. That's how it's represented in the book. Those are some interesting ways that you can start to engage with our experience with technology in fiction, but it feels like almost no one's really doing that. So I think I think David Shields is being provocative, but I think he's onto something.
Is he onto something, Brian?
I think so. I think that there's something old-fashioned about books, and I think when you look at the music industry and how that has changed so incredibly over the past even 5-6 years, and then you look at books, there's this whole conversation about e-books and print books, and this people, I think, that read, or avid readers, tend to be people that are, I think they're maybe more traditional in a way. I think that they like having the printed book in front of them. I think that they like being told stories. I think that they appreciate that. And I think there is something very sort of old school about that. But I can understand from some people that aren't readers that don't see books as having any value in their day-to-day lives in this modern world, that to actually pick up a print book, let alone an e-book, but to pick up a print book and read it seems something, a bit of a novelty. Like I don't have time to read. I hear that a lot from people. I don't have time to read, and it's kind of a shame that people feel that way. But for a lot of people, it's a luxury. They see it as something that's not really practical.
Joanna, maybe it's time to change the terms. Maybe we've just outgrown the literary distinctions between fiction and nonfiction. What do you think?
It's a difficult question. I don't know. I think that maybe in some ways that we have, but I think that they're important, definitely at this stage, to continue to think about those distinctions, because just as so many of us have brought up here, there are distinctions to be made, and there are responsibilities that we have as writers and as readers, and I think that those still need to be thought about, and if that, and that sometimes requires very specific language, at least, to provoke questions and reactions.
Okay, folks, we have about 2 minutes left, and people always want to know what writers are reading, so I want to go around the table and ask you what you're reading. Let's start with you, Vincent Lam.
David Mitchell's Thousand Autumns of Jacob de Zoet.
Fiction?
Fiction.
Fiction. John Barber, what's on your nightstand? You probably got a pile of books that you have to read for work.
6 finalists for the Giller Awards, including Michael Ondaatje, Essie Edugin. We should learn to say that name. Patrick DeWitt. Let's see if I can name off all 6. I'm going to stop there. Jeffrey Eugenides' novel, The Marriage Plot, definitely worth reading. Pick it up.
That's your pick?
That's my pick for anyone looking for a Christmas gift for someone who loves a big old-fashioned read.
Okay. Joe, what are you reading?
I'm reading a John Irving book, A Prayer for Owen Meany. A bit old, but I've never read it, so I'm enjoying it.
Nice. Johanna?
I'm reading Tony Judd's post-war Europe after 1945, so history.
Brian?
I just started Marina Endicott's The Little Shadows.
You recommending it?
Yeah, it's good. It's a print book, which is, I just finished my first e-book. I got a Kobo, and the battery ran out the last 10 pages of the book.
You got to plug it in.
And I thought, well, there's one down, strike one for Kobo. But anyway, so now I got the print anyway.
It's like not plugging in your cell phone. You can't actually blame the cell phone for you not plugging it in.
It's true.
Okay, well, you'll read the last 10 pages in the book. Thank you all for coming in today.
Thank you, Pia.
Brian Francis, author of Natural Order. Next to him, Johanna Skibbsrud, author of This Will Be Difficult to Explain. Joe Dunthorne is the author of Wild Abandon. And on the right-hand side of the table, John Barber, publishing reporter with The Globe and Mail, and Dr. Vincent Lam, who is an emergency physician and author of Bloodletting and Miraculous Cures. And your new book is coming out in the spring. Remind me what it's called.
The Headmaster's Wager.
The Headmaster's Wager. Thank you all very much.